Hi, I'm Pastor Dick Stadler, and I'm here again with Ann Carter and with Tim Carter, and we're talking Sunday readings. And the readings that we want to discuss today are the readings that many people will hear read in their churches on Pentecost 9, the ninth Sunday after Pentecost. The Old Testament lesson that we're going to be focusing on is Genesis chapter 15, verses 1 to 6. And the New Testament epistle is Hebrews chapter 11, verses 1 to 16. And then the gospel is in Luke chapter 12, verses 22 to 40. The Old Testament lesson from Genesis 15.
A reading from Genesis. After this, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. Do not be afraid, Abram. I am your shield, your very great reward. But Abram said, Sovereign Lord, what can you give me, since I remain childless, and the one who will inherit my estate is Eleazar of Damascus? And Abram said, You have given me no children, so a servant in my household will be my heir. Then the word of the Lord came to him, This man will not be your heir, but a son who is your own flesh and blood will be your heir. He took him outside and said, Look up at the sky and count the stars, if indeed you can count them. Then he said to him, So shall your offspring be. Abram believed the Lord, and he credited it to him as righteousness.
Anticipates the lesson that we had about 3 weeks ago from Genesis 18. And in this one, Abraham is concerned about not having an heir and maybe having to make a servant in his household his heir. And God says to him, no, you're going to have a child from your own loins. And that's the promise that keeps recycling itself through the Abrahamic story until finally Isaac is born. So as we take a look at this very short little reading in Genesis, what kind of questions do you think people are going to have as they sit in the pew and listen to it?
Well, this was interesting because it calls back to the reading from a couple weeks ago. And a question that I just had, because I don't remember offhand, is how many times was Abraham promised a son? Because now we've heard it twice now that he's been promised this. And how often was this promise made?
Let's stop there and take that one question at a time. We know that it started in Genesis 12.
Okay.
Because God had said to him, I will make of you a great nation, and that requires having descendants. And then he goes on to say, in you all families of the earth shall be blessed. And so he blesses him already in chapter 12. Then you're going to hear this repeated now in 15. You're going to hear it repeated again in 17. You're going to hear it repeated again in chapter 18. So at least 4 times that I can count, you will hear that promise.
Okay.
In one form or another, or implied. Okay.
Okay.
Now, what was the next question that you had? Because you had a good one coming up.
Well, the other question I've got written down here is, so yes, so Abraham is told this promise here, and in the passage we heard a couple of weeks ago, the promise is told again, and during that other time, Sarah was surprised to hear this. So I'm wondering, does this mean that Abraham didn't tell Sarah about the promise? And I guess that is a larger question. Has he told her any of the promises that have been made, or is he keeping it all to himself? And this is all a surprise to her. This is all news to her.
Well, what's your guess, Ann? I mean, you're a mother and a wife and a woman. From a woman's perspective, from a woman's perspective, what would be your assumption? Because the text doesn't tell us about any conversation between the two of them.
Yeah.
Well, I didn't read this again. I didn't read the story of Hagar and Ishmael, but it seems to me that there was this understanding that there was going to be a child, and Sarah didn't believe it was going to come through her, and that's why she did the whole surrogacy business with Hagar. So I think that she was probably told. I think that she just didn't believe it anymore. This is like the story we had a couple of weeks ago. The
Mhm.
men are there, and then the Lord says, yep, you're going to have this kid. And she said, you told me that already. And I'm just tired. I'm old. I'm tired. It's hot. I don't believe it anymore.
When this promise is first made in Genesis 12, we're told that Abram was 75 years old.
Yeah.
He's
Yeah.
10 years younger, so she's 65, and she doesn't get to have the baby until she's 90. So she's waiting.
Wow.
And
Mhm.
that's why you can understand her impatience and say, look, I don't think it's going to come through my body, but lose my slave girl and have a baby through her. Maybe that's how God will keep this. And then God has to come back and say, no, as old as you are, I'm going to have a baby from you. Yeah. So there's some human dimensions to this whole story that ask us to ask certain questions and to
Yeah.
try to get an understanding. Yeah.
Mhm.
Interesting.
What when Abraham is taken outside, God
Mhm.
says, look up and count the stars. Now, I
Mhm.
took astronomy at the University of Michigan, and they told us at that class that with the naked eye, you could only count 1,000 stars. I've never tested that because I don't know how to keep track of which star I've named and numbered and so
Yeah.
forth. But even if that's the case, that's a tremendous number for him to think of when he has no children yet. That
Yeah.
he's going to have 1,000 descendants minimum, and then many more. So that's a wonderful visual lesson that God is giving him here to emphasize he's going to have it. And then when he builds an altar out of gratitude for the promise of God, he recognizes that he has that the Canaanites are possessing the land that God is promising to him. And so it takes faith on his part to believe eventually this is going to belong to my descendants.
Hmm.
And then God tells him, okay, I know according to human logic, Eliezer, your servant, is going to become your heir. You're just going to name him your heir, which is apparently capable of being done in Old Testament law. But God says, no, you're going to have your own. And here's where we have the great passage that Paul picks up on when in verse 6 of chapter 15, it says, and he believed the Lord, and the Lord counted it to him as righteousness. And Paul will say, see, that's how righteousness works. It's a gift from God, and God credits it to us. It's not something that we earn by being such morally perfect people. Yeah. Any other thoughts on the Old Testament lesson before we move on to the epistle in Hebrews?
Reading from Hebrews. Now faith is confidence in what we hope for and assurance about what we do not see. This is what the ancients were commended for. By faith we understand that the universe was formed at God's command, so that what is seen was not made out of what was visible. By faith Abel brought God a better offering than Cain did. By faith he was commended as righteous when God spoke well of his offerings. And by faith Abel still speaks, even though he is dead. By faith Enoch was taken from this life so that he did not experience death. He could not be found, because God had taken him away. For before he was taken, he was commended as one who pleased God, and without faith it is impossible to please God, because anyone who comes to him must believe that he exists, and that he rewards those who earnestly seek him. By faith Noah, when warned about things not yet seen, in holy fear built an ark to save his family. By his faith he condemned the world and became heir of the righteousness that is in keeping with faith. By faith Abraham, when called to go to a place he would later receive as his inheritance, obeyed and went, even though he did not know where he was going. By faith he made his home in the promised land like a stranger in a foreign country. He lived in tents, as did Isaac and Jacob, who were heirs with him of the same promise. For he was looking forward to the city with foundations, whose architect and builder is God. And by faith, even Sarah, who was past childbearing age, was enabled to bear children because she considered him faithful who had made the promise. And so from this one man, and he as good as dead, came descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and as countless as the sand on the seashore. All these people were still living by faith when they died. They did not receive the things promised. They only saw them and welcomed them from a distance, admitting that they were foreigners and strangers on earth. People who say such things show that they are looking for a country of their own. If they had been thinking of the country they had left, they would have had opportunity to return. Instead, they were longing for a better country, a heavenly one. Therefore God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them.
Hebrews 11 is the great heroes of faith chapter. It lists all these people who by faith did this and by faith did that and so forth. So it's quite a catalog that we get in the first 16 verses. But what questions does that raise in your mind, Tim, as you listen to this whole catalog?
Well, the one line that struck me as odd, and I don't see the verse here. I'm looking for it, but for the exact verse. It's the end of 4, right before 5. And by faith, Abel still speaks, even though he is dead, is the line. And I thought, what do they mean by that? What do you mean he still speaks? Is it that the lesson speaks to us? Is it that he is actually talking? What are we supposed to get out of that? What is that supposed to mean, or what should we think of that line?
Well, some people assume that the reason his sacrifices were more acceptable than his brother's sacrifices, Cain's, is that he was offering animal sacrifices, whereas Cain was offering stuff from the garden, vegetables. Right. And what this suggests to us is that God was commending him and accepted his gifts because of his faith in God. Okay. And that tells us by implication that Cain was probably not a believer in God, and he resented it when Abel got rewarded or was accepted, and so he kills him. And jealousy can do that, and so so his faith still speaks even down to the present time, saying, whatever you do is acceptable to God when it's done from faith, but your works are not what make you acceptable to God. And that's not what God is accepting. But when you trust in God and you accept his grace and his forgiveness and his love, then he will produce all these things that are very acceptable to him. Yeah, that's one way of looking at it. I don't know if you've read something different, Anne.
No, I think it's just the lessons of a life lived. All of these people, that they had incredible challenges. God asked them to believe some incredible things, that he would get them through something that seemed impossible. And yet he did. And we can read their acts of, if we can call them heroism, by believing in a God that asks the impossible and then delivers the impossible. That their lesson speaks to us today, yet that we can and we should do the same. He might not come and promise that we're going to have children in our old age, things like that, so directly. But we've all heard his voice, I think, in the back of our head, or we've thought about a problem and then all of a sudden a solution presents itself that we understand that might have come from outside us. Well, trust it. Trust that God is guiding you, believe him, and then see what happens. That's
this writer to the Hebrews gives us insights into Old Testament stories and people and their faith that we would not have without the New Testament. And many Jews look at Abraham, Noah, and so on, and they say the reason they were chosen by God is because they were so righteous. You know, the righteousness came first. and their ethical behavior came first, and then God chose them because of that.
Mhm.
The writer of the Hebrews reverses that and says, no, they are justified because of faith, and they are righteous because of faith. And so Noah wasn't any great paragon of virtue that he was chosen. Look, he gets drunk after the flood and ends up having sex with, no, I'm mixing him up with somebody else. But anyway, the point is, what is said in here is gives us insights that we would not have otherwise. Look at verse 11. By faith, Sarah herself received power to conceive. Okay, that's the miracle. Even when she was past the age, okay, we've known that from the two previous readings we've had from Genesis.
Yeah.
And then it goes on to say, since she considered him faithful who had promised. So even though she laughs when she's told, or she overhears that she's going to have a baby, what this text tells us is that she eventually came around to trusting in God all the way because of the promises of God. And I don't think we would have that view of Sarah if all we had was Genesis, but this fleshes it out and fills in the blanks. And that's why in verse 13, these all died in faith, not having received the things promised, but having seen them and greeted them from afar. And so that's the way we live. We don't know that, we haven't seen heaven yet, but we believe it's there because God has promised us. And just faith to believe.
Yeah.
So any other thoughts on this text before we move on to the gospel?
The Holy Gospel according to Luke. Then Jesus said to his disciples, Therefore I tell you, do not worry about your life, what you will eat, or about your body, what you will wear. For life is more than food, and the body more than clothes. Consider the ravens. They do not sow or reap. They have no storeroom or barn, yet God feeds them. And how much more valuable you are than birds. Who of you, by worrying, can add a single hour to your life? Since you cannot do this very little thing, why do you worry about the rest? Consider how the wild flowers grow. They do not labor or spin, yet I tell you, not even Solomon in all his splendor was dressed like one of these. If that is how God clothes the grass of the field, which is here today and tomorrow is thrown into the fire, how much more will he clothe you, you of little faith? And do not set your heart on what you will eat or drink. Do not worry about it. For the pagan world runs after all such things, and your Father knows that you need them. But seek his kingdom, and these things will be given to you as well. Do not be afraid, little flock, for your Father has been pleased to give you the kingdom. Sell your possessions and give to the poor. Provide purses for yourselves that will not wear out, a treasure in heaven that will never fail, where no thief comes near and no moth destroys. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Be dressed, ready for service, and keep your lamps burning, like servants waiting for their master to return from a wedding banquet, so that when he comes and knocks they can immediately open the door for him. It will be good for those servants whose master finds them watching when he comes. Truly I tell you, he will dress himself to serve, will have them recline at the table, and will come and wait on them. It will be good for those servants whose master finds them ready, even if he comes in the middle of the night or toward daybreak. But understand this, if the owner of the house had known at what hour the thief was coming, he would not have left his house to be broken into. You also must be ready, because the Son of Man will come at an hour when you do not expect him.
The gospel is Jesus talking to his disciples, telling them, don't be anxious about your life, what you're going to eat and so forth. God takes care of the ravens, and God feeds them. So how much more valuable are you than birds? And look at the vegetation, and God will clothe you even more adequately than what the field is dressed in its colors. And don't be afraid to give to the needy, but be ready, because I'm still coming back. And so there's all these wonderful assurances. You can trust God to take care of you. Don't worry, don't be anxious, but live in a state of readiness. So what questions does that raise in your mind? What thoughts do you have about this text?
Well, I guess I'd just kind of like confirmation that I'm reading this correctly. From verse 35 down, it's about watchfulness and about keeping watch, and the servants and the master, and when the master comes back. And there's also a bit here about a thief, when the thief is coming. And the master would not have let his house be broken into if he knew when the thief was coming. The way I was looking at it, we are the servants, God or the Son of Man is the master. But then I'm wondering, who is this thief? And I guess part of that is this two metaphors or two stories that the first one is, we are the servant and he is the master. And then the second one is that we are the master of the house and we need to be on watch for the thief. How should we be looking at this watchfulness passage? And if it is one passage, then who is the thief? And who is who? I guess this is the only way I know how to say that.
Well, I'll take an initial stab at it if I
Okay.
may.
Please.
I think it's two separate, interlocked, but two separate. So I think that the first example is when you are ready for the master and he comes home from the wedding, he will serve you completely, totally out of social norms. The master never serves a slave, but because he loves you, the master is going to do this. So be ready, not because you deserve it, not because you expect that this is going to happen. You be ready because you love the master and you want things to be ready for him. And then as an example, you don't know when the master is going to come, because if you knew when the house was going to get broken into, you wouldn't have gotten broken into. So it's kind of an explanation of why you need to be alert. The thief will wait until you're asleep. That's when they will pounce. So you need to be alert. It's two different examples of the same idea.
Readiness.
If I said that correctly.
That makes sense.
Yeah, I agree that you've got two different parables here. The first one saying, be ready and vigilant for the return of your master, because when he comes, he's going to wait on you. That's what Jesus says. When he comes back, he's going to give us eternal life. He's going to give us what he has earned for us, not something that we have earned for ourselves. And these servants are knocked off their feet probably by the thought, he's going to serve us a meal after he comes home from his wedding feast. But the second one is different, because there the master is the example, and he would not have even left the house if he knew the thief was coming. And that's what the text says. And so it's a state of readiness. And in both cases, readiness is what's being emphasized, and to live with readiness. Now, I want to ask Ann a question based on your reading of Ken Bailey. Remember how he said in one of our discussions that a person who knocks on the door in the middle of the night is what? How does he characterize that person?
He characterizes it as an outsider of the village, and probably an enemy, that he would knock and then the family would be alarmed.
Isn't it interesting that when Jesus introduces this first story in verse 36, he says, the master comes home from the wedding feast, and so that they may open the door to him at once when he comes and knocks. And he doesn't say speaks to them. Hey, I'm home. He knocks on the door. And so maybe what Ken Bailey was saying applies in some cases, but not universally, and
Well, Bailey does have an explanation for that, and his explanation is he believes that the wedding feast was in this guy's house. And that the master leaves the wedding feast and comes up, and because of the noise of the party, he knocks on the door to let his servants know that he is coming in. That's one explanation, is that the servants wouldn't have been able to hear him if he had just called. I guess I don't know enough about culture to know if he's right or wrong, but I
Yeah.
thought that that was very interesting. And that the master is while he is in the middle of this feast, it doesn't say the feast is over. He excuses himself and he brings food to his servants, and therefore he makes them a part of the party. Even though they have their own jobs to do serving him, he still makes them part of this grand wedding feast that we all participate in, whether we are at the wedding or whether we are still serving here on this planet, in this life.
Well,
Again,
it's certainly an interesting connection between the first part of this reading, which says, don't worry, don't be anxious, God will provide for you, and then you'll be able to be generous to other people. But at the same time that you're living that lifestyle, also constantly live in a state of readiness because Jesus is coming back. And it's a good time for you. It's not going to be a good time for people who have rejected him or who don't have God's righteousness. But for you, I'll look forward to that, but be vigilant, because don't let it catch you by surprise. You know? Anything else on these texts for
No.
ninth Sunday after Pentecost? I want to thank you all for watching. We want to thank you for liking us if you do. And if you want to subscribe, you can subscribe, and then you'll receive a notification every time a new video is put up. But may God bless you so that you can follow him, trust in him, and that he can work through you to touch many, many lives with his blessings. God bless you.
amen.
Right.